The streets hold many secrets. From alleyways in the heart of London to the quietest country lane, they've all witnessed cruelty and violence, jealousy and despair. They've seen crimes of passion and cold-hearted murder. They've seen killers escape and killers brought to justice. In this series, we'll be investigating the most notorious crimes and intriguing mysteries. Stories of men and women who killed, of the police who hunted them, and the victims who were left behind. From the files of Scotland Yard and far beyond, this is the dark history of our streets. The First World War shattered France. The long and bloody conflict cost the lives of over 1 million French soldiers. Many more were wounded. But as the country bled, in Paris, a serial killer was on the hunt. This is the story of a man who murdered women, of the society which let him, and of the 2 women who stopped him. Henri Landru is perhaps the most notorious serial killer in French history. Yet the story of his crimes is little known beyond his homeland. Even today, the exact number of his victims is unknown. We do not know how Landru killed them, or what he did with the bodies. The police investigation was botched. The trial was a farce. In fact, Landru's crimes may never have been discovered were it not for a 32-year-old housemaid from Paris. Her name was Marie Lacoste. She walked with a limp, was unmarried, and had little education. Reason enough for the establishment to patronize and ignore her.
In France, the whole idea that equality, one of the great ideals of the French Revolution, applied to women, it just didn't hold.
France had something called the Civil Code, which was established by Napoleon at the beginning of the 19th century. And according to the Civil Code, women have the same status as children and as the insane.
Women were not regarded as fit people to manage their own finances. So their brothers, their fathers, and then when they married, their husbands looked after their money.
Women were not taken seriously. They were not taken seriously as credible witnesses. They were not taken seriously as having intellectual powers. Their ability to tell the truth fundamentally was questioned because they were only women.
But Marie was not one to be deterred, for she was convinced that Landru was responsible for the disappearance of her older sister, Célestine. Célestine had been a lonely woman. Her husband had died in 1912, and her son Gaston was with the army. Then on the 1st of May, 1915, she saw a Lonely Hearts advert. It was in Le Journal newspaper and read, "Monsieur, aged 45, single with no family, savings of 4,000 francs, having own home, wishes to marry a lady of a similar age and situation." Célestine replied at once.
The fact that the war removed the vast majority of able-bodied young men was something which had a hugely negative effect on women's chances of getting married.
There were about 1.5 million military casualties. That means that the population of young men is decimated, probably quite literally. And also, after the First World War, there are 600,000 widows in France. This is a massive demographic shift.
Basically, there's an opportunity there because you have a lot of women whose husbands have been killed at the front, and either for love or for money, whether they were lonely or because they needed a man to support them, they are very, very vulnerable.
Women were brought up in this era to trust men, to believe that respectable men were going to tell them the truth, they were trustworthy.
Landru catches Celestine at a very, very vulnerable moment for her. She is just achingly lonely. She is a woman who wants to have a husband, to settle down, to be respectable and have a nice family life.
Landru posed as Georges Fremier, an industrialist from the German-occupied city of Lille. Their first meeting seemed to go well, but then Fremier disappeared. Celestine must have thought the worldly and darkly handsome monsieur from Lille had found a better prospect. So she was delighted when he called at her apartment again in the summer of 1916, and there was soon talk of marriage. The idea horrified Celestine's younger sister, Marie.
From the beginning, Marie, it's quite clear, is very suspicious of Landru. He claims to have come from German-occupied France, which means that, unfortunately, he has left all his personal papers in the occupied zone when he fled to Paris. And so there is no way that the women can prove or disprove his alias.
I am not sure that Marie disliked Landru from the start. I suspect she grew to dislike him more for what he represented than for his personality.
It's his manner, I think, as much as anything else. This is where I think Landru lets things slip. He is too effusive, too oily, really. He has a very large vocabulary and he's full of kind of flowery compliments and generally kind of sucking up to the women he's trying to seduce. Now, Marie is not fooled by that.
In August 1917, Marie tried to share her misgivings with her sister. But Celestine was in love. The two argued. From then on, Marie was to hear nothing more from her sister, and she assumed Celestine had chosen her future husband over her family.
Basically, because she's had enough. Marie washes her hands mentally of Celestine and decides that her sister is a fool.
Marie's reaction to her sister's disappearance is understandable in the context of the time. There's a war going on, and it's not going well for France. For the inhabitants of Paris, it's particularly uncomfortable. People are leaving Paris in considerable numbers, if they possibly can do so. Your sister disappears. It's almost easier in the context of the last 18 months of the war, if you are living in Paris, to assume that, like so many others, you have taken the chance to go.
For more than a year, she tried to put her sister from her mind. Then, in December 1918, Marie received a letter. It was from Gaston, Celestine's son. He'd been blinded during the war and needed to contact his mother urgently. Marie reluctantly agreed to track Celestine down. But when she went to Celestine's apartment, she found no sign of her. Celestine had moved out, the concierge said, more than a year ago. Nobody had seen her since. Marie was alarmed. She already thought Célestine's fiancé, Monsieur Fremier, a liar and a fraud. Could he be a killer as well? It was January 1919. The First World War was over at last. But Marie Lacoste's private battle with the serial killer Henri Landru was just beginning. Nobody had seen her sister, Célestine, in more than a year. There'd been no letters, telegrams, or telephone calls. She'd disappeared.
The timing is crucial because this is 1919. The war is over. If Célestine was alive and had simply gone elsewhere, you might have expected by now that she would have been in contact.
Marie had long been suspicious of Landru, but she didn't think her sister was in physical danger until this point.
Marie puts two and two together, at which point she goes into overdrive and decides that she's got to assemble a case and get Landru arrested.
Marie had never liked Célestine's fiancé, the mysterious industrialist, calling himself Georges Fremier. She was sure he was behind her disappearance. So on the 11th of January 1919, Marie presented herself at a Paris police station. She took with her a dossier of evidence. It described Fremier and Villetric, his strange house outside Paris. It described the money he had taken from Célestine before her disappearance. It described all the times Fremier had come to Marie's door insisting Célestine was alive and well. The dossier was detailed and comprehensive. The police showed no interest whatsoever.
The policeman gives her short shrift, says this isn't a case that concerns Paris. You're going to have to refer your inquiry to the authorities in Gambé, the village where Célestine disappeared.
There had been no enthusiasm, no sense that she had a right to inquire. She was seeking to pry into somebody's private life, and she's a woman seeking to do it. So that in itself was peace or war, felt to be improper.
Despairing, Marie fired a letter off to the mayor of Gambé, begging him to investigate. He refused. Her sister was not known in the village, he said, nor was anyone by the name of Fremier. The last lines of the mayor's letter, however, offered Marie hope. For the young housemaid from Paris was not the first woman to ask about the man living in Villetric. Perhaps, the mayor suggested, Marie could contact her instead. Rino Moreau was 25 years old when she first met Henri Landru. It was Christmas 1916. More than 18 months had passed since Rino's older sister, Anna Colombe, had replied to a Lonely Hearts ad in the Le Journal newspaper. Now, she was engaged.
Anna Colombe was a woman who seemed to keep her life in compartments. She is very close to her family who live in Paris, and particularly to her younger sister, much younger sister, Victorine, who's about 20 years younger than her. Anna is quite capable of looking after herself. She's certainly very thrifty and builds up a pretty good nest egg, working eventually as a typist in a typing pool in Paris. So that is one side of Anna's life. Now, on the other side, she also takes a string of gentleman lovers. Nothing wrong with that, but she has a little girl And the father is probably one of these lovers, a man called Bernard.
If you were a woman who had, say, had a baby out of wedlock, for example, you were in an irregular position and your child was illegitimate, by marrying a man who would legally recognise your child, you could therefore regularise your status. And so you could change your status from one which was dishonourable to one that was honourable. And he was offering that possibility.
Reno was suspicious of the man she knew as Fremier. He had long avoided meeting the family, and Anna had confided that he used a different name to claim benefits from the government. That was fraud. Reno was eager to get a closer look at him at dinner that Christmas Eve.
She finds Landru's tales less than convincing. His promises to Anna, she finds less than convincing. But Anna wants to believe them. And that must have both upset and infuriated Reno.
This pretense that Fremier, as she knows him, this guy from the north of France, German-occupied France, who claims to be an industrialist, a factory owner, who's planning to set up a factory in the south of France. He's borrowing money from Anna. Why is he doing this? I mean, Reno is pretty shrewd, and she can see that actually it doesn't add up.
When Reno and Anna were with their elderly parents on Christmas Day, Anna made a startling confession. She had lent her future husband 8,000 francs, all the money she had. The family was stunned. This Fremier was clearly a swindler. They had to get Anna out of the relationship.
But as the family debated what to do, Anna met up with her fiancé once again. On the 26th of December, the couple took a train out of Paris to the village of Gambay. Landru bought the tickets, a return for himself, and a one-way ticket for his bride-to-be.
Over the next 9 months, Reno grew increasingly worried. Nobody had seen Anna, but the police weren't interested and didn't even register as a missing person. Finally, Reno launched an investigation of her own.
Victorine, who has never been to Gambay, nonetheless is able to write to the mayor of Gambay and say, my sister's gone missing. This is the man I met. He's called Fremier. This is where he lived. Do you have any record of him?
They must have been pretty certain in Gambay that the person she was identifying was in fact the person they knew as Monsieur Dupont. But the right to privacy in a powerfully patriarchal society meant that you were not going to tell a sister that a property belonged to somebody who was using another name.
He writes a letter back at the third time of asking, because he first of all doesn't reply, saying, I'm terribly sorry, we have no record of anybody called Fremier in the village. I can't help you.
Rena reached a dead end. She despaired of ever finding her sister until, early in 1919, she received a letter from Marie Lacoste.
These are two very, very different women from different social classes. So they're not natural allies, but I think what would have probably brought them both together was the fact that they were both obviously very, very intelligent, and they were furious.
They start talking to friends and friends of friends, people who might have some memory of something that Celestine might have said, or something that Anna might have said.
What they did was quite clever. They filed a complaint, a persons missing complaint, with the provincial authorities in the province where Gambay was located. What that meant was that it obliged the authorities under civil law to pursue the inquiry.
They knew they were right, and so they had to find a way of making sure this information was received. They needed to be taken seriously. They needed to go through a man, and a respectable man.
Rino makes her father, who's quite old, who's had nothing to do with the inquiry really, put his name on the complaint. It doesn't have Rino's name on it.
At last, the authorities began to take an interest in the missing women. But their inquiries were half-hearted, and they found no trace of the man calling himself Georges Frenier. Once again, it was women who did the job of the police.
A friend of Marie spotted Landru in a Paris shop. Marie phoned the police, who retrieved a business card Landru had left behind. It had his address on it. On the 12th of April 1919, Landru was arrested. He was taken to the police station at Rue Greffule. Found among Landru's possessions was a small black notebook. It was filled with a jumble of notes, codes and diagrams, dates and times, expenses and profits. And on an otherwise clean page, a list of women's names. At long last, police had begun an investigation into the missing women. It was not Henri Landru's first brush with the law. The 50-year-old had a long history of criminality. He'd been on the run from police since 1914.
He has this strange career where he is obviously talented, but he never holds down a job for very long. He's an accountant to an architect. He's an assistant to a toy maker. He's a furniture salesman, so he flits about. But all the while, he's actually swindling as well and descending into petty crime.
He'd been successful, and yet he'd not been successful. He'd served prison sentences on several occasions because he'd not got away with it.
The last swindle he executes, which is actually by far and away the most successful of his career, he dupes a whole lot of investors into investing in a bogus factory which never existed. He's racked up enough, and he knows this, enough convictions that he will be deported if he's found guilty. So that is why he goes on the run.
The accusations against Landru were now far more serious. Police searched a Paris garage he rented. They found women's clothing and ID papers, jewelry and photographs. Police feared they were dealing with a serial killer, but their investigation was flawed from the beginning.
Firstly, there is a very, very hasty, strictly illegal search by the police immediately after Landru has been arrested. They do a quick search of the house in Gambé and then out into the sort of backyard behind the kitchen. But the police are in such a hurry to get him formally charged, they don't on this occasion even bother to go down to the bottom of this huge garden to investigate the rest of it.
They presume if he is a serial killer, they can break him. They presume that he won't have been competent, and if the evidence is there, that they will find it.
2 weeks later, the formal search is undertaken, and this time they find underneath a pile of leaves in a shed at the bottom of the garden, they find these charred bone fragments mixed up with animal bone fragments, and also in there are charred bits of women's apparel, things like sort of buckles and hair clips.
They are, I think, very taken aback by the fact that neither do they come across readily identifiable evidence of murder, and nor do they manage to break down Landru. He stonewalls them in the way that the authorities had stonewalled Marie and Rino. He gives them effectively nothing.
They had more success identifying the women on Landru's list. Jeanne Cuchet was the first. In late 1914, she and her teenage son André had moved with Landru to the small town of Vernouillet, 20 miles outside Paris. After a few weeks there, they disappeared.
Next was an Argentine, Thérèse Labordeline.
The 46-year-old was also invited to the house in Vernouillet. She too would then vanish.
The next name was Crozetier. It was not a woman, but a street, Rue Crozetier.
This was the home of 52-year-old widow Marie-Angélique Guillen. She too had replied to Landru's Lonely Hearts ad. To her, he was a Georges Petit. Again, he promised marriage and a new life, this time in Australia. Instead, he took her to his home outside Paris, and she was never seen again. After the disappearance of Marie-Angélique in August 1915, Landru left Vernouillet. Neighbors had complained about the foul-smelling smoke that billowed from the chimney at night. But when police came to search the property 4.5 years later, they found nothing.
The house in Vernouillet is not exactly private.
You've got neighbours on either side, and on one side, because it's a hill, that neighbour can look directly into the garden. The back garden goes up a hill, so in those days you could look straight down into the garden and indeed had an eye line into the bedroom at the first floor of the house. And by August 1915, when who knows how many women he's killed, the neighbours are getting very suspicious, and he scarpers. He ends the lease and he leaves, I think in quite a hurry.
Villa Trique lay just outside the village of Gambay. Nobody had lived there in years. It was damp and cold, but it had a large garden with a barn and sheds, and was less overlooked than the house in Vernouillet.
This was where Landru brought the other women on his list. Besides Reno's sister Anna and Marie's sister Celestine, there was Berthe Eon. She was a 55-year-old cleaner, rebuilding her life after the deaths of her husband and 3 children.
There's certainly a pattern where the most sinister thing is that the last time he takes them to Gambay, he buys a return ticket for himself to the nearby railway station and a one-way ticket for the women. Some of the women disappear almost immediately on their first visit. Others are seen around the village. Because it's wartime, preoccupations are elsewhere. Their preoccupations are with all the men who've gone off to the front.
Don't think he's killing them to silence them. I don't think he respects or regards women enough to think that he needs to get rid of them. I think it's become more a question of he wants to.
André Bublet was a 19-year-old whom Landru picked up on the metro. Nobody saw her after April 1917. Louise Jaume, a 38-year-old devout churchgoer, estranged from her family, then went missing that November. Annette Pascal had first met Landru in the autumn of 1916. She vanished in the spring of 1918. The final victim on Landru's list was Marie-Thérèse Marchadier. The 37-year-old prostitute told friends she was engaged. And early in January 1919, she came to Gambay with Landru. She disappeared days later. Within a few months, police would be at the house, searching for her remains and those of all the others.
They would be disappointed. In the garden, they uncovered skeletons of a cat and 3 dogs, all belonging to vanished women, all strangled. But the only possible human remains were fragments of charred bone. If Landru had murdered anyone here, he disposed of the bodies carefully.
The police had all sorts of problems trying to sort of prove what he had done.
Landru will have known that the most challenging things in terms of identification were going to be hands, feet, and the head. And the odds are that he cut off the extremities, and those almost certainly he will have burned in that convenient, handy, small but operational oven.
There are various episodes where foul smoke is smelt and seen coming out of his chimney.
He will then have portioned up the remaining torso, legs, arms, and wrapped them in parcels. There is evidence that suggests that he made use of nearby ponds. There were quite a few around. And also the surrounding land was quite boggy.
The circumstantial evidence was strong, but without the bodies, the case was weaker than it looked. 2 years passed. The investigation continued as Landru's defense delayed proceedings again and again. Finally, a date was set for the trial, and defending him would be the most famous lawyer in France, Vincent de Moreau-Gieffry.
This guy is regarded in France, and I agree with them, as the greatest, or certainly one of the greatest trial lawyers in any language. He's an absolute master of courtroom technique. He can judge a moment when to go in hard on a witness, when to ease off.
Moreau was undoubtedly at the height of his legal and oratorical powers. He was a shrewd, cunning, a very impressive lawyer, somebody who had justly earned his reputation as the leading defender of the time.
He was one of a type of lawyer who was willing to take on cases that seemed almost indefensible. So he was known as the lawyer of the disadvantaged, in French they would say the disinherited. I think he took on the case partly because he probably personally enjoyed the notoriety and the excitement of defending somebody so awful. But I think he also wanted to stop this person being sentenced to death, to being guillotined. And he felt that that would be a great symbolic achievement.
He so heartily opposed the death penalty that he was willing to take on a case like Landru's as a matter of principle.
Moreau did not like Landru. He was a difficult client, arrogant and overbearing, but Moreau took the case all the same. He made it his mission to save Landru from the guillotine.
On the 7th of November 1921, the hearing of Henri Landru began in Versailles. Marie Lacoste and Reno Moreau's tireless detective work had brought Landru to court. But here,
the men were firmly in charge once again, and the trial was becoming a farce.
There could sometimes be a quite anarchic feel inside French courtrooms. Court proceedings were very theatrical and very confrontational, so they were great entertainment. But on the other hand, it meant that the audience got very excited and quite difficult to calm down.
The courtroom is too small. It's just a cramped courtroom, probably with a capacity of about 250. The first thing that happens is the judge, who basically just wants to be in the newspapers, he allows the photographers into the courtroom for the entire duration of the trial.
Women are packing the galleries, and they're not coming dressed in somber and silent mode. They're dressed up to the nines. They are talking, they're waving their fans, they're waving scent bottles.
By the end, you've probably got about 500 in there, and the judge has just completely lost control of the court. There's shouting, people are bringing in picnics, they're smoking. There's some evidence that some guy has a quiet piss in the corner.
So the whole thing has an awful lot of excitement, which has very little to do with the actual criminal proceedings.
It was the 9th day of the trial that Marie Lacoste's turn came. Her fellow amateur detective, Rino Moreau, had already given evidence. She had faced the man she believed killed her sister. She'd done her duty. Now, it was Marie's turn. She didn't let her sister, Celestine, down.
Her evidence was very possibly one of the most powerful testimonies given.
She sticks very tightly to her witness statement, which is very plain and factual and detailed, a bit like her.
Marie Lacoste is convincing because of her own absolute conviction, her absolute sincerity.
Landru tried to stare down women testifying against him, and some of them just couldn't cope with it. And you see Marie, she just stares straight back at Landru. She's just not intimidated by him. And at the end of her testimony, there's a very telling moment. Before she leaves, she stands up because she's been allowed to sit, I think almost certainly because of her poor, lame leg. And she turns to the jurors who are behind her, all these men, and she just says, "This man murdered my sister."
It was her anger, it was her passion that Landru was responsible. That's what makes her testimony so powerful.
The defense lawyer, Moreau, did not cross-examine Marie, nor was any mention made of the role she and Rino had played in bringing Landru to this place.
Landru mostly watched, scribbling notes in color-coded dossiers. At times, he would leap to his feet, shouting and gesticulating, demanding proof he had committed these crimes. His lawyer, the brilliant Moreau, did not contest the charges of theft and fraud. There was no possibility of Landru walking free. Saving him from the guillotine was his only concern.
Without physical evidence of murder, they could offer only theories about what had happened to the missing women. They insisted that Landru had killed for money, that he took advantage of women besotted with him and burned their bodies in the oven of his home. The problem was, this didn't fit the evidence.
I don't think you can make a credible case for Landru killing for money. Several of his victims had no money.
It seems to me that most of his crimes were motivated by fantasies about power. He wanted to have power, he wanted to control people.
What makes much more sense is that Landru had a voracious sexual appetite and was consistently looking for sexual partners, and that having killed once, he was prepared to do it again many times.
You then get into questions about, well, why did they construct this case, which depended so much on the idea that it was a single motive, money, and nothing else. And I think it was because they were trying to construct a case that was simple enough for the jury to understand because of the scale of what he had done and the complexity of what he had done.
Despite these weaknesses, the task for Moreau was not an easy one. The press had already dubbed Landru the Bluebeard of Gambé, after the mythical nobleman who murdered his wives. In the eyes of the public, Landru was guilty. All Moreau's powers of rhetoric and persuasion were not to be enough. By 9-3, the jury convicted Landru on all 11 counts of murder. Moreau had failed. Landru would die.
On the 25th of February 1922, a guillotine was erected outside the prison in Versailles. At 6:04 in the morning, Landru was led out. His beard had been trimmed back and he wore a collarless shirt. Nothing could disturb the path of the blade. There to witness his death were his lawyer, Moreau, and a representative of the government. Beyond the police cordon, crowds gathered.
With arms and legs pinned, Landru was forced onto his knees. His head was placed in position, then the executioner released the blade. The most notorious serial killer in French history was dead.
How Landru's victims died and what became of their bodies are also mysteries, as is the true number of women he killed. Convicted of 11 murders, many believe he was responsible for far more.
Landru almost certainly killed more, probably many more women than the ones on the list.
He had a particular proclivity for targeting vulnerable women, and those were the types of women who were effectively invisible, often in society. Their disappearance would have not particularly gone noticed.
It's interesting that they discover evidence of 282 responses. They do go looking for those who might have responded and not have been followed up on. But we know that there were certainly 72 of those respondents who were not traced by the police.
I think Landru didn't set out to be a murderer, he became one. I mean, it wasn't as if I think there's any evidence that he killed before the First World War. Why did he kill the others? I think the terrible truth is that in the end it just came down to hatred of women.
Henri Landru tried to obliterate his victims. Perhaps he burned them in his oven or dumped them deep in the woods. But there are things even the most determined of murderers cannot erase. The love of those left behind, their grief, and their determination to fight for justice.